When the war in Iraq began this spring, many cities and towns held support the troops rallies. The subtext of these rallies was that someone did not support the troops, and looming in the background of that subtext is the widespread belief that the U.S. mission in Vietnam was betrayed on the home front, and that soldiers were greeted with hostility when they returned from the war in Vietnam. The iconic image of that belief is a spat-upon Vietnam veteran. In some cities this spring, including Nashville, North Carolina, Spokane, Washington, Burlington, Vermont, stories of current veterans being spat on, current soldiers now in uniform being spat on, or other acts of violence against soldiers were weaved together with stories of Vietnam veterans having been spat on to create a climate that intimidated anti-war activity this spring and contributed to the sea change of public opinion regarding the campaign in Iraq. The image of the spat-upon veteran, however pervasive, is a myth. If we go to the evidence, go looking for evidence that it actually happened, this is what we find, if I could have the first slide. No, this is not a malfunctioning, go back just a second, not a malfunctioning projector. This is what we find if we go looking for evidence that it actually happened. There's no photos of these incidents. There's no newspaper reports of any such spitting incidents. There's nothing or very little in history books that would sustain any such belief. No evidence supporting the allegation that Vietnam vets were spat on. And most telling, going back to that period of time, the late 1960s, early 1970s, nor will you find that there were claims being made at that time that anybody was being spat on, claims being made by Vietnam veterans that they were being spat on. You won't find that, or at least I didn't find it. Now, I hasten to add here that I can't prove a negative. I can't prove it didn't happen, just like we can't prove that those weapons of mass destruction that don't exist. The best we can do is go looking for the evidence and, finding none, report what we don't find. What I can show, however, is what did happen in those years, and I can argue, or will argue, that what I do find is wholly inconsistent with the image, with the idea that Vietnam vets were spat on. You have the next slide. The historical record on the other side is actually quite rich. This photograph is 1965, taken at Fort Devens in Massachusetts. And I chose it because of the placard that's on the upper left-hand corner, the placard reading, "We like people, soldiers." We like soldiers. This was a newspaper photograph, in a Boston newspaper. And I chose this because many of the stories, or some of the stories of veterans being spat on, actually also have claims in them that soldiers were met at airports or at bus terminals with placards that had things like "baby killer" on them, or other kinds of derisive statements against Vietnam veterans. Placards make great newspaper photos. Asked what their reception home was from peer groups, their peers, their age group peers who had not served in the military, 93% said they received very friendly, or somewhat friendly homecoming. Okay. Those numbers are astounding. Those numbers are better than what you as a group will report when you go home. A placard like that. And the only time I've heard of placards like that is in the stories of spat-upon Vietnam veterans. But I've never seen that. And so when I saw this, I was struck by this. I didn't go looking for this. But the fact that there is something like this, but there's an absence of any photograph, at least again that I have found. I can't say that it's not out there, but I've never seen such a photograph Yet there are many stories out there that there were placards like this. But this is the historical record. I mean, this is what we have. There is evidence of this type that people did express their solidarity, their support, their sympathy, perhaps, if you will, for Vietnam veterans. 99% of Vietnam vets in 1971 reported very friendly, or somewhat friendly receptions home. 99%. What's really astounding is when you compare that, right, with what the belief is today. That's what we have. How do we get from there to where we are today in terms of public perception of what was going on? I think the image of spat upon Vietnam veterans also functions in the culture in some kind of dangerous ways. One of which is that it functions to help construct an alibi for why we lost the war. Right? The alibi runs that we were not defeated by the Vietnamese, that we were defeated on the home front. Right? We were stabbed in the back, we were sold out by liberals in Congress, by radicals in the streets, and that's the reason that we lost the war. And had it not been for that, we could have won the war. Right? And what that does is keep alive the idea that the United States can embark on any kind of military mission that it wants, and if we have solidarity at home, right? If we the people will just stay behind that military mission, by golly, we can win. This is the only representation that I've found, or that I've been presented with, of the spat upon veteran image. This is it. This is from a G.I. Joe cartoon, a G.I. Joe comic book about 1985. Yet, millions of Americans who never saw this have in their mind, right, a picture that looks very much like this. Right?
But in fact, every study of the class composition of the anti-war movement has concluded that opposition to the war was highest among poor and working class people. Veterans and active duty service people were not targets of the anti-war movement, but a crucial component of it. Furthermore, although some of the most spectacular public anti-war activities did take place in the 60s, the anti-war movement had a major impact on the course of the war in the 1950s, and the movement was most effective in the 1970s. But one cannot comprehend the history of the Vietnam War without understanding how the anti-war movement influenced that history from the beginning to the end, which raises the first question about that history. When did America's war in Vietnam begin? And why? In September 1945, the month after our Vietnamese allies, that's Ho Chi Minh and his forces, had defeated the remnants of the Japanese power in Vietnam, they established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV. Ho Chi Minh, standing before 500,000 citizens in Hanoi, the capital of the new nation, read its Declaration of Independence, beginning with these words, quote, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all the peoples on the earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live, to be happy and free," unquote. Suddenly, 2 airplanes appeared overhead, U.S. P-38 fighter bombers. The crowd looked up. When those hundreds of thousands of people recognized the U.S. insignia, they burst into a mighty cheer. General Philip Gallagher, the U.S. commanding officer in the region, would soon go on Hanoi radio to join in the singing of the nation's new anthem. But at this precise historical moment, the United States was beginning its war against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, a nation that never did anything to us except ask for our friendship and support. The first of 8 U.S. troop ships were diverted from their task of bringing GIs home from France and instead were being loaded with an army to invade and conquer Vietnam. This army was armed by the United States and financed by the United States. It consisted largely of Nazi soldiers, including many SS units forced into the French Foreign Legion. Of course, this invasion army was under French command. Its purpose was to restore French colonial rule. We need to remember, and this is a crucial point, we need to remember that this all took place prior to the so-called Cold War. This is a chronological fact with great historical significance. Why? Because of the anti-war movement in 1954. Thus, from 1954 until the early 1960s, there was very little public awareness that a war was going on. When the anti-war movement re-emerged, it was more and more energized by the discovery of the government's duplicity. In that great 1974 documentary, Hearts and Minds, Daniel Ellsberg outlines how, quote, the American people were lied to month by month about Vietnam by Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. And then he says, quote, it's a tribute to the American people that their leaders perceived they had to be lied to. As the war escalated, the movement grew not just in size, but in consciousness. Then came the Tet Offensive in 1968. As I said earlier, one cannot comprehend the history of the Vietnam War without understanding how that history was shaped by the anti-war movement, nor can we understand the anti-war movement without understanding American society and history. The Tet Offensive coincided with the climax of the urban rebellions, the so-called long hot summers that began in 1964 and culminated in April 1968 in the week after the murder of Martin Luther King, when revolts broke out in 125 American cities. These revolts were in part expressions of the effects of the war on American society, especially on the poor and working people who were forced to fight while suffering its economic consequences.
One thing that happened to me that was negative, probably that's the only real negative. Nobody spit on me because I kicked their ass. I mean, I think that's if I could. I believe that none of that happened. But comments that were made perhaps to other veterans in the room and the veterans' wives are things that stick. A comment made to me coming out of the church about baby killing because he knew I was in the Navy is just surprising, and it sticks in your mind. And as you say, when you recall that, maybe that, recall anything, the story changes, whether the fish get bigger or littler. But statistically, probably 99% of the people were not unfriendly to a person coming home. Maybe they didn't care a lot, but not unfriendly, except for that one comment that sticks in any veteran's mind, and then maybe that is why some of this negative things there, because you remember one or two real things that you don't do anything with. It's not like it's going to make you mad. It's like, I can't believe that the other person said that.
Myth. This guy was wounded in July of 1969. Was medevaced. Spent some time in Japan, Dakota and Zama, medevac to the States. Spent some time in Valley Forge Army Hospital. After there about 2 months, had the opportunity to go home. was taken by his ward master down to the Philadelphia bus station. He lost part of his elbow, and his wounds in his legs were so large that they had to stay open because of the necessity to cut the flesh away. He was steel stitched because the wound was so great, so he could go home. He looked like Quasimodo, really, when he was walking in the Philadelphia bus station. A young man and two lovely young ladies saw him. He was dressed in uniform. And they kicked him and they assaulted him. To stop his wounds from being open, he got in the fetal position. Nobody in the Philadelphia bus station helped him. He was able to crawl and get away because I think they got tired of kicking him and able to get home. Now that myth was a guy by the name of Frank Paris. And that's me. So here's a myth. Here's a guy that went back to Vietnam. This time was pretty lucky. Landed in California. And there were people outside the gate throwing feces at them. So that's another myth. So if you're looking for a myth and no pictures taken, I'll be glad to talk to you after this is over with, and you can take my picture. And I speak to my brothers and sisters who served and served proudly. Now, maybe there wasn't any newspaper, but let me give you just one more example. In my little hick hometown, about 6 months ago, we had a rally to support our troops. And there was one picture on television and one picture in the paper. And it was a sign by one individual that was there that said, "Good soldiers don't kill for oil." But there was no film and no pictures taken of the parents that were there with pictures of their daughters and their sons that were serving in the military in a rather hostile environment. This is not a story, it's fact. It's not a myth, it's fact.
Well, my point is that your story is not an exception. There are a lot of reports like that.
So why don't you believe it?
We can play mental gymnastics all night.
Let's let him answer the question, please.
I'm willing to believe, but I also look for, as a historian, as a sociologist, I also have to have some cooperative evidence. I can say, I would like to believe your story. It's an accusation. It's a very serious accusation. You're accusing someone of assault. That's very serious. If I was a prosecutor, we put this into a legal framework. What you have is an accusation. An accusation is not evidence. It might be true. I can say, I want to believe your story. And we can't, I don't think we can bring it down to any one story. That's why I say there are a lot of stories like this. What raises my skepticism about the stories as a group is that if these things had happened as often as they are now believed to have happened, there would have to be some sort of evidence from that point in time. Some sort of newspaper reports, some sort of police reports. Somebody would have reported something like this. You said, nobody did anything to help you. That may very well be true, but I don't think it could be true that in dozens, maybe scores of cases like that, that nobody would have reported it to the police. There would be no
no documentation, no newspaper reports. That I don't believe. So I think that there is, even if I were to say, okay, you present a compelling case, I believe you, that still leaves a lot of questions to be raised about the body of those stories as a whole. There is still something else to be talked about, to be discussed.
And I don't know about the spitting image. To me, though, I think it was an attitude, probably in a lot of cases more than actual events. But in our case, our government spat in our face. He came back, he had worked for our welfare department. And in every case that, supposedly perfect scenario would be when you were in war, you came back, you were to receive your job. I mean, you could walk in and have that job back. But because he was working for the government, and the Democrats were out, the Republicans were in, they had no record of this man working for the welfare department. And so they told him they would give him his job back, only temporarily until he could find something else. Then he had to go to the unemployment office, this college graduate, and go through this demeaning process of having to sit there and having these people tell you when you go for a job interview, make sure your hair is washed, you're wearing a clean shirt, the pants are pressed, and it is demeaning. And I dare say the Vietnam vets in this room experienced, and their families experienced the same thing. And then we figure the government must owe us at least $1 million because they screwed up our case so badly. He went in May, and we did not even get our first allotment check until September, October. And then when they gave it to us, they took it back away. I mean, there are so many issues here that the government are the ones who spit in our faces. Maybe not. It was not actual, but the hurt that we went through from our own government after he served our country is what I see as most veterans have had to deal with. It was like, we were getting it, and our friends loved us. And our family, they weren't going to do that. The rest of the people just didn't care. So we didn't have that animosity as much as people throwing things at us. But it was like, there was no one there to really, and that's a true story.
The same volume from which the handout that you have, the survey research on Vietnam veterans reporting in 1971 how they felt about their Homefront. That volume, I encourage you, all of you, to get that volume through interlibrary loan or some way, because there are just lots of questions that bear on things like this, issues of employment. What's been your experience in trying to find a job? Again, that data from that point in time is very different from what is believed now to have been the case. Again, any one story can be true, but I think that as teachers and scholars, and we're talking in general, right, about what the situation was at that time. And again, the data from that time, I think, is what we have to go back to. Not our memory so much. Again, although any one situation is different. But the collective memory, the social memory, how the country is processing what was going on, is really an important thing that we have to be looking at.
I'd like to respond to that. I couldn't agree more. And the most extreme example, of course, is Agent Orange. And
all you have to do is look at this man's body, and he's got it.
Yeah, right. Which under total denial up and down. We're all teachers here, and I just want to address that from a teaching point of view. The first day of the class I give, called Vietnam and America, it's in New Jersey, Newark, Rutgers. I played Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA. And I asked students, well, how many people, no, first I asked you, well, how many people are familiar with Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA? Everybody, raise their hands. What is this about? What does it have to do with Vietnam? And maybe a third of the students understand that that song is talking about exactly what you're talking about. And then another third thinks that it's a great, patriotic hymn celebrating war and so on. And then when they actually look at the text, which I talk about as the first poem we're going to read in the course, they start understanding. And I think the key in teaching that is to focus on the word they. Got a little hometown jam, they put a rifle in my hand.
I've long thought that your attitude is exactly right, that I was spit on became a metaphor, that your own terrible experience, and I deeply regret that that happened to you, was rare, whereas the whole collection of abuses or disinterest that veterans experienced became expressed metaphorically as I was spit on. I'm not a sociologist and I haven't done the research. Who's next?
You don't know who they hold, you don't know which veterans they talk to, you don't know if they talk to a group that was treated very well. So you could also take from the other side of it that perhaps this was a percentage of veterans who were treated well, and there's a whole another percentage of veterans out there that weren't. So, I don't know, I guess I have some skepticism towards the government document from
It was a Harris poll that was commissioned by a Senate.
Vietnam veteran a month after he returned 13 months. This was January of 1969. We walked out of a university doorway. There were 2 students, one girl, one boy. The boy had a very long army coat that you could buy anywhere, Navy coat. They made some comment against the war, and I opened my mouth. I don't recall what I said, but I mentioned that he was a Vietnam vet, and the boy stood up and spit on him. The veteran put his head down and walked away, and I was really angry, and I couldn't understand. I said, why didn't you say something? He looked at me and he said he wouldn't understand. So there were no cameras, and he felt that it was impossible to try and explain to the student exactly what he had gone through. And now I've been an educator for 32 years, and I am also the widow of that veteran.
There was a disclaimer at the back of that deal.
Yeah, could you take the microphone? Hey, step up to the podium right now.
Get it going, Marie, let's go. On the back of that says, we are an equal opportunity educational facility. We admit, regardless of race, color, religion, creed, national origin, prior convict status, sexual preference, or Vietnam veteran status. Well, it happened to be that the vice president of the college was my commanding officer in the Marine unit that I was presently serving in. So I didn't have to have an appointment. I was also part of faculty. So I go storming up there and I knock on the door, and his secretary says, oh, the vice president's busy right now. So tell him Gil's here. I hear the buzzer goes, oh, send him right in. I threw the brochure on there. I said, General, this is totally unacceptable. Take a look at this. What am I? A different sex? A different religion? Some type of communist or some type of convict? And he looked at it and he said, oh my God. Well, I rue the day that I left that on his desk, because I would love to have that as proof. And just because there are no pictures to prove something doesn't mean it never happened.
Yes.
Yes.
And you know what? I can take a picture and I can use statistics to say anything I want.
As you were.
Okay, first thing I want to say is I don't really care what you guys think. That's the first on the preface that I saw some of these things happen. And just because you want to revise history, you make yourself feel good, is irrelevant to me. Gil said just because you can't prove it did happen or didn't happen doesn't didn't happen. And so, I'm sitting over here trying to bite my tongue off because, first of all, you're trying to revise history, say what you want, and you're entitled to your point of view. And what you have to understand is the reason that the folks went in the military when they said the oath is they sort of hold the Constitution to protect your right to do whatever you want to do. So you're free to protest and say whatever crap you want to say because the guys went over there and they died so you can do it. And it really pisses me off when I listen to this revisionist stuff that you folks are saying. And it almost seems like I'm reading Mountain Tom, a little bit of book. And
But you can't teach.
I'm proud of what happened to our veterans, and I'm ashamed to hear what I'm hearing from you. And that's all I want to say.
We all have to teach with some reference to the historical record.
That's true.
You can't.
You have to stop.
I'm very clear that I can't prove the negative. I can't prove that it didn't happen. That doesn't then, or shouldn't, become a license to say in a classroom that it did happen. If you're going to teach in the classroom that it did happen, you better have something besides 30-year-old oral histories to base that on.
So the truth is the truth, not the truth.
These stories, no, look, these stories don't begin to appear until roughly around 1980. How to know a myth and a legend when they hear one.
I really like to speak to this. I'm rather disturbed by this question being phrased like this coming from a teacher. Because I think as teachers, we have an obligation to our students to help them learn how to find out what is true and what is not true. Not just taking people's opinions or memories or their views, but to find out how to go to the primary sources that are verifiable. You can't debate with the primary sources. There's nothing about this war which is not controversial, which is not debatable. But we are supposed to help students, guiding them to understand how you get to what is true. If you have some quarrel with what I presented as history, I'd like to confront that directly.
Let me cut.
I was in the Air Force from 1968 to 1972, in Vietnam in 1972. I didn't see this mass, protest and disobedience toward our mission there. I didn't see any of it. I'm sure it existed some places. I had soldiers not salute me, but that's different than this mass disobedience, this undercurrent of being important. I just plain didn't see it. We, by and large, did our jobs. So I think it needs to be put in perspective.
Oh, I think that's true about the Air Force. I was giving a very abbreviated account here. I tried to underline my surprise when that started materializing within combat crews, which was during the Christmas bombing and not before the Christmas bombing. It was a phenomenon within the conscript ground army. Then it was a phenomenon within the Navy, and only at the very end, and only in that brief period of time did it surface in any way within the Air Force. And that's what really, it surprised me that it was in the Air Force at all.
We really don't have the photographs to support it. We as educators often tell our students, you can't believe everything that you read in newspapers or what you see on television because we're getting biased opinions. We know that political correctness was around even in the early years of the Vietnam War. Is it not very possible that some of those photographs did in fact exist, and yet they were not acceptable enough to be published from the viewpoint of those who were in the media industry? And in fact, when we talk about going to primary sources, you have many in this room who are primary sources.
Amen.
And they are those that are willing to share their experiences. So I find it difficult to believe that possibly some photographs did not exist, but only that they were not published.
There's a rich record in this country of photographs that not just professional journalists took. When Vietnam veterans came home with cameras and lots of experience taking photographs. Vietnam veterans have collections of thousands of photographs. All kinds of people took photographs during those years. I've been giving talks like this for 5 years, and nobody's ever presented me with any photographs. I went through the photo archives at Boston Public Library for a now defunct Boston newspaper that turned over all of their photos. Thousands of photographs there. If anybody's from the Boston area, go look at it. Thousands of photographs from the Vietnam era of anti-war demonstrations. I went through all of those photographs. There's nothing. I mean, there's no placards reading baby killer. There's nothing. Now, again, I'm not saying it's not out there. I mean, somebody might pull a picture out of their pocket here, but it's nobody's presented me with anything. And again, you can't then say whatever you want. You can't fill in those blank spaces, right? And say, well, there's no evidence that that it ever happened. Therefore, it must have happened, right? You can't do that either. You have to go find you have to find something to base that claim on.
Yes.
I'm finding this discussion really interesting. I am an American Studies professor, and I look. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thank you for telling me. Yeah. I'm an American Studies professor, and I've done a lot of work with my students on the Enola Gay exhibition, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with at the Smithsonian. And I'm also a folklorist, and a former historian. So I'm coming at this, hearing you all a little bit differently than perhaps a historian or a literature scholar might hear. And I'm hearing a couple of things that I think are useful for everybody who's an educator, all of us, no matter where we're sitting on the podium. One is, what I'm hearing a lot of the people who took part in the Vietnam War reacting to, because I can feel everybody jump every time you say legend or myth. And I think what a lot of us hear when we hear legend or myth is, it's not true. And what I'd like to suggest is that in an anthropological understanding of myth, and I say this to you too, what a myth is it's a kind of a charter for action. It doesn't mean something that isn't true. And I don't know if this is how you're using it. I'm just offering this as a way to think about it. That is, when we're talking about something that's a myth, we're talking about a kind of a large-scale, sacred understanding of how we want to act, and it's based often on stories of the past that sanction how we ought to act in the future. And that's an interesting way to think of what our experiences are and how we tell them. And legend is a way of constructing these things to talk to each other. Doesn't mean that it's not true, but there's different kinds of truth. I hear that you're discussing a kind of truth that's based on documentary sources, and that's an important kind of truth to look at and to understand as context, because it's there, it does exist. And there's another kind of truth that I'm hearing from these stories that you all are telling, not stories as it didn't happen, but stories as narratives. I'm using it in that sense. Narratives that are also an important kind of truth of people's perceived and remembered experiences. Now, one of the debates that's been going on, certainly since the Enola Gay, but I can hear that it's an important debate here, and it's an important debate in southern Vermont and northern Massachusetts, where a whole different story but parallel in time is taking place. which had to do with the commune movement, people had different sets of experiences. Some of them were based on their memory that they were telling from 30 years earlier, and some of them were based on documents that were in the town halls. I'd like to suggest something to everybody as educators. If I had a bunch of, well, and I've done this with my students, I think what would be important is to ask your students to talk to the people who were alive and active during the time period that you're talking about, doing their own oral histories, talk to the whole scope, and also set them to work in archives. Because when we were looking at the Enola Gay, there were a lot of issues that were identical that came up. There was documentary evidence of many different kinds that showed that there were questions about the bombing of Japan. And there were also real understandings and experiences and memories that people had who were the bombers, who fought in World War II. And a really interesting question to ask your students is, what is the relationship between memory and history? What would be different? How do you all who are remembering and talking about it, and I'm not saying it wasn't true, but how can you help students understand how a memory might have consolidated during 30 years later, and what you can imagine it felt like at the time, and help them understand that, and also help them look for the documentary sources that will confirm, contradict, tell different stories, and then how do you reconcile that? What do they mean? What do they mean? What does your personal experience mean that happened? What does the telling of the experience mean? Because sometimes the experience and the telling of it are two different things. And how does that work with other kinds of records that exist? And then how do you portray that? How do you portray that in records? CDs, spoken word narratives. How do you portray that in books? How do you portray that in museum exhibitions? Because these are important questions. Whose story gets told? Is there only one? And what are they based on? Why are the memories and the stories, the narratives, since stories is a touchy word here, but why are the narratives so important, and what's their relationship to other kinds of documentary sources?
Sure.